really honored to have social entrepreneur and visionary Leila Janah here to talk about her new book, Give Work. She is the CEO and founder of Samasource and LXMI, two somewhat different entities, but with a shared through line, which is described in this book. And her conviction that the most meaningful and lasting way to change the lives of the many millions, even billions of very desperately poor people around the world is not to give them charity, but to give them work. And that meaningful work is a powerful driver of social change. And in the book, she talks about that, and she will talk about that today, how she's done that and how she started these firms and nonprofits and the work that they've achieved around the world and that she continues to build. So please join me in welcoming Leila Janah.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be back in Los Angeles. I'm actually from San Pedro, if you guys know where that is. Take the 110 all the way south. So it's great to be back here and sharing the message of Give Work with all of you. I'm going to start with some good news. So first of all, we know that the world is unquestionably better in many regards in terms of the incidence of violence, disease, on all kinds of indicators. The world is better than it has been since the dawn of agriculture. There are, I think, two big exceptions to this rule. One of them is the destruction of natural resources, and the second is global poverty. And if we think about so many of the major social issues that we try to solve downstream, really the root cause of those issues is extreme poverty, is people living on less than a few dollars a day. And to give you an idea of what this translates to, it means 300,000 women are dying each year in childbirth. The World Health Organization estimates that 99% of those deaths are preventable and solely due to living in poverty. It means that 780 million people are living without access to clean water. It means that 2.5 billion people are living without access to decent sanitation. Now, our approach to addressing this issue is typically to provide some sort of aid. Let's build poor people wells. Let's build them schools. Let's build them toilets. But I'm going to encourage you to think a little bit differently about this problem because international aid in many ways has failed us. It hasn't delivered the sorts of results that we're looking for. And I think part of the problem is that we so often are attacking the symptoms rather than the root cause, which is global poverty. Let me humanize this a little bit for you. What does it mean to live on less than a few dollars a day? This is a place called Mathare in Nairobi in Kenya. And this is a slum that about 1 million people live in. And we actually work in Mathare. I'm going to tell you the story in a minute of a young man that I met there who comes from this neighborhood and who had an incredible journey moving out of poverty from here. But this is what life is like if you make less than a few dollars a day. Ken Kihara, the young man that I mentioned, had grown up an orphan in this slum, had managed to get through one of the best boarding schools in Nairobi on a scholarship, speaks beautiful English. When I met him, it was hard to imagine that this young man could have grown up in an area that is as post-apocalyptic looking as that slum, but that was Ken's reality. He graduated from high school and he had to go back to the slum because nobody would give him a job. In Kenya, youth unemployment rates can reach 70%. There are no jobs for slum kids. So Ken goes back to the slum after getting educated and gets a job in the informal economy. About 1 billion people around the world work full-time and still earn less than $1 a day for their efforts. These are the people who are selling stuff by the side of the road, who are breaking big rocks into smaller rocks in quarries, who are engaged in all kinds of informal economic activity that has no job security, no income security, and many other challenges like bad working conditions. This is actually an example of one of those jobs. Ken started brewing a local kind of moonshine called changa. It's like a local hooch that's sold on the side of the road in Nairobi, and those guys with those barrels are actually getting water out of that really filthy river, the Mathare River, to brew this moonshine. It's literally mixed with kerosene and sold on the side of the road, and Ken told me that people in the slum drink this to forget themselves. This is not a Hollywood movie. This is happening today in a big city in Kenya. And so that was Ken's story. I met him. This is his daughter, Rosalind, and he had been struggling to make ends meet living in this slum despite being educated. Now, our typical approach to helping someone like Ken involves aid, involves charity. And I wanted to just take a step back and explain how this system got started in the first place. Believe it or not, our era of international aid started with the US sending aid to Europe after World War II, during the Marshall Plan. We sent boxes of food to help families who were struggling to recover after the war. One of the biggest aid agencies, CARE, which is still around today. I used to serve on their board. The term care package actually comes from this time when we would send care packages full of American food to these European families. And so what started as a temporary stopgap to immediately address this emergency situation after the war evolved into the aid system that we know today, where Congress has these big allocations that go to aid agencies, transferring things like food aid. And what we found is that this system is really bad for local markets. There's been a lot of work done on food aid, for example, on wealthy American agro-businesses getting contracts to send food to countries that are in the middle of a famine. And while that might seem like a good idea, so often what results is that local farmers are put out of work and local food systems are thrown into disarray. And so what started as a stopgap and became this full-fledged system, I think has created a lot of challenges. In the last 60 years, we've transferred about $1 trillion in aid from Western countries to sub-Saharan Africa alone, and yet real per capita income for the poorest people has stagnated. We still have about 350 million people, just like Ken, living on the continent on less than $1 a day in extreme poverty. So the system isn't working. What is a good replacement? I argue that giving work is far superior to giving aid for a number of reasons. One of the most powerful reasons actually is in the relationship that people have with their own leadership in government. If you think about it, if you are a government leader in a poor country and most of your money is coming in from foreign donors, who are you ultimately accountable to? It's the same problem we have with campaign finance here in the US. Ultimately, you're going to be accountable to where your money's coming from. And when your money is coming from the tax base, from local citizens as a politician, at least in theory, you have more of a relationship and more of an obligation and a social contract with your citizens. There are so many other things that work brings, right? We all know the adage, feed a man a fish and you feed him for a day, and teach him to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Well, we see all of these benefits, and that actually plays out in a lot of the data that we're now getting back on international aid versus getting cash directly into the hands of poor people. We now know that the most effective aid program is to increase the real incomes of the lowest income people directly. We have two ways of doing that. We can give them cash. There's now a very popular organization called Give Directly, which allows you to donate, and so your money can go directly to a low-income person. Or, even better than giving them cash as a one-off, give them a job that pays them living wages directly. We know that when we do this, people tend to invest in exactly the sorts of things we would want to see, especially when we give that cash to women. Women globally invest 90% of their paychecks in household and community expenses. And again, exactly the sorts of things we would want to see from the best designed aid program. They're investing in healthy food, good schooling, adequate health care, decent housing. So literally the best aid program that we can possibly offer is jobs, specifically jobs targeting low-income women. I came across a really interesting new way to create jobs among low-income people several years ago. I had been working as a management consultant in India, and I met a young man who came into this call center that I was working for from Dharavi, which is South Asia's largest slum. It's where Slumdog Millionaire was filmed, if you guys have ever seen that movie. And the idea that somebody could come from this Slumdog Millionaire background and then take calls for someone in the UK about their airline ticket blew my mind. And I thought, well, maybe this is a way we can create jobs for low-income people. I had been working in the aid field for many years. I'd spent a lot of time working in poor communities in Africa and Asia, and I'd been searching for ways to create jobs at scale in areas where there's little infrastructure. Well, the beauty of the internet economy is that for the first time, we can circumvent geography in creating jobs for the lowest income people, which means theoretically that people's economic future doesn't have to be determined by an accident of birth. And that is a really powerful new megatrend. And to put this in more human terms, this is what the internet looks like as it's rolling out across Africa. This is a picture we took in northern Uganda. That's literally fiber optic cable that was sitting in these spools on the roadside, and these women were digging ditches along the roads for this cable to be laid. So East Africa got 11,000 miles of fiber optic cable in the last couple of years, lighting up a whole part of the continent that had previously never had high-speed internet. This means that the internet is far cheaper and more accessible to people even in places like rural northern Uganda than it's ever been. So this trend, coupled with my experience consulting in India, made me think, well, maybe I could reinvent this outsourcing model and find a way to make it relevant for the poorest people. I had studied what Muhammad Yunus, the pioneer of microfinance, had done in banking. And I thought maybe we can do for this outsourcing field what Muhammad Yunus did for banking. He realized that by taking this sector that had never really enfranchised poor people and breaking down big loans into smaller loans, he could then convince people to fund these small loans, and he found out that there were really high success rates in low-income people paying back these small loans. We now know that people who receive small loans, especially women in developing countries, have extremely high repayment rates. And the only way he figured that out was by disrupting the traditional banking model and realizing that he needed to create smaller units of finance, of access to finance in order to enfranchise poor people. So I thought maybe we could do something similar with outsourcing. Maybe we could take these big data projects and break them down into smaller units of work and train low-income people like Ken, who can speak English, who can be taught to use a computer and basic software to do these kinds of work. So I started in 2008 a nonprofit called Samasource. Sama means equal in Sanskrit. And our mission is to help people move out of poverty by connecting them to digital work. We started with 4 computers. I found a guy in Nairobi who was running an internet cafe, and I convinced him to try doing a data contract with me. And I had an entrepreneur friend in Silicon Valley who needed people to digitize text files, basically to convert PDF files into text files, which is no longer needed because software can do that all for us now, but this was back in 2008. It was less advanced. So I started this organization, and the mission was to hire people like Ken, pay them living wages, and get them to do work for big tech companies that had lots of budget to spare. Since then, over the last 9 years, we have grown to be the largest data services company now in East Africa. We employ 1,300 full-time workers. And we've been able to secure contracts with some of the biggest technology companies in the world. And what's remarkable is that many of them, when they start engaging with us, don't even realize that we're a nonprofit. They're engaging with us because the quality of the work done by people like Ken is so high. It's a really remarkable testament to the amount of talent around the world that goes untapped. You see here a picture of our center in Nairobi, but I think what's really exciting about this model is that we've been able to make it work even in rural locations. We have a center in northern Uganda that is made out of shipping containers with solar panels on the roof, and we're now the largest non-government employer in that region, doing technology-based work for companies like TripAdvisor and Getty Images. And what's remarkable about that center is that we're employing people who came out of a 20-year civil war. How many of you guys saw that Invisible Children video about Joseph Kony? Anyone saw it here? Check it out on YouTube. It's a really moving video about this horrific civil war that happened in that region and a warlord who was abducting child soldiers. Well, now that the war is over, the biggest challenge people have is finding jobs. There are tons of NGOs and nonprofits operating in northern Uganda, but very few business employers. And so I'm really excited we've been able to employ over 400 people in that region. So what does this transformation look like at the individual level? What does it mean to move out of poverty and get a job that pays living wages? We do a lot of surveying. Anyone who's worked in the nonprofit or development field knows that you're not taken seriously unless you publish like a ton of data, probably very little of which actually gets read. But if you're curious about learning more on how we measure, you can check out samasource.org/impact. But we do household surveys and all kinds of detailed surveys to understand not only what people are making, but what they're spending their money on. And it's pretty astounding to put yourself in the shoes of someone who's living on a few dollars a day. So before Samasource, on average, our workers are earning $2.20 a day. What does that mean? What is your life like? It means that you're living in informal housing. There again is a picture of Ken. That is him going into his first home, where I met him. Right outside is an open sewer. I'm holding his daughter, Rosalind, and when I walked into this scene, she was playing right next to that open sewer. Then you get an idea of why there are cholera outbreaks and all kinds of really horrific diseases that spread in these areas. So you don't have money to have decent housing. The second thing is you don't have money to buy good food. We actually look at what our workers are eating, and we find that before Samasource, many of them in Nairobi are eating sugarcane as a primary source of calories because it's so cheap. Not the best fuel for making good decisions, right? The next thing we find is really limited access to educational opportunities. So even if your government allows you to attend school for free, you still have to pay for books and transport and uniforms. And beyond that, for many poor people, there's an opportunity cost for going to school because you can't be working during the day and your family might need that income. So you don't really have the money to pursue higher education. And lastly, inadequate health care. At this income level, you cannot afford health insurance. If you go to the public hospital, you often have to bring your own supplies to get treated. Post-Sama, our workers immediately start earning a living wage, and what's remarkable is that they stay at that living wage long after they leave us. So we do surveys even 3 years after the workers leave our facilities and find that they have stayed out of poverty permanently. So we quadruple their incomes on average. And what does this mean? It means that your life is totally different. This is one of our workers, Martha, on the left, in her first apartment that she got after leaving the slum. So the first thing our workers do is they start buying healthier food and moving into better housing, which immediately reduces their risk of all kinds of avoidable diseases and other conditions like violence that happen in the slum. We see them investing in school fees for younger people in the family and saving for college education for themselves. And lastly, they get health insurance, so dramatically different health outcomes. We've now been able to guarantee this outcome for 36,000 people, 9,000 workers and their income dependents at home who have moved out of poverty permanently. What I'm most excited about is that last year, Samasource became profitable as an earned revenue nonprofit, meaning that now we can say this model has worked and it's worked well enough that it can cover its own costs and therefore should get a lot more aid investment. We could replicate this all over the world. And that's what my mission is today, is to figure out how we can scale what we call a give work model, not just in data services and digital work around the world, but also in other industries where we could hire social enterprises like Samasource to serve the needs of corporations. I'm going to talk a little bit about our US program called Sama School, which operates in San Francisco and New York, to give you an idea of how we've been able to adapt this model to challenges here at home. So I started our US program because in 2009, I got a really nasty email from a guy named Joe in Ohio. True story. We'd released these ads on Hulu, the internet streaming service, and they had given nonprofit ad budgets away. So we put together a little PSA that featured workers that we trained in a refugee camp. So these are literally some of the most destitute people in the world who I thought were really inspiring to watch on this ad. And I got this email from a guy, the subject line said, "You are ruining America." And I was like, man, Joe, I was so poor at the time. This is a nonprofit. I'm definitely not doing this to become rich. And then I get this email, and I slept on it and didn't respond until the next day. I was immediately tempted to write something nasty. And the next day I wrote, "Dear Joe, maybe you have a point. Maybe there's something that we can do here in the US. Maybe we can adapt this digital work model for places like Ohio, which have seen really, have been really hard hit by the recession." And so Joe immediately changed his tune. The next email he sent was really sweet. We ended up not communicating beyond that, but I did go to my board after that, and I said, maybe there's something we should do here. And I hate the idea that we should be siloed in the poverty reduction world. So often we think of these international NGOs fighting poverty in Africa as totally separate from the nonprofits that are fighting poverty domestically, but these are the same issues. They're the same moral issues, they're often the same structural economic issues. So I think that organizations should be working more broadly and focusing on, if they can, adapting their models to different geographies. So we studied the problem in the US and realized that what Samasource does overseas wouldn't work here for a number of reasons, partly because all net employment growth, this was a study done by two labor economists named Katz and Kruger, all net employment growth in the US between 2005 and 2015 happened in alternative work arrangements, basically independent work, contracting. Didn't happen in full-time jobs of the past. We've seen a dramatic transformation in labor in the US towards what we call the gig economy. people working on their own time, often facilitated by internet platforms. Now, regardless of your opinions on whether this is good or bad, the fact remains that it's happening. And what's really scary is that none of our traditional job training programs that are funded by government, funded by nonprofits, are teaching people how to benefit from this new gig economy, which is really scary. We're ignoring the single greatest change in the labor market in the last decade. And so Sama School, our domestic program, focuses on teaching people how to benefit from the gig economy. And we focus on low-income people in New York and San Francisco. We also have an online course at samaschool.org that has enrolled about 50,000 people, teaching them how to make money doing digital freelancing. And so the model is we partner with local agencies that already do job training. We just signed a contract with the City of San Francisco's Workforce Development Department. We give them the curriculum, and we equip them to teach their trainees about this whole new world of work. What does it mean for someone who's going into this? They go from training to job acquisition on one of these platforms, and hopefully a longer-term career that involves more of a portfolio approach to income at the start. Our trainees typically earn substantially above minimum wage. So we see people coming in who've been working, $8 to $12 an hour jobs with fixed schedules and not a lot of flexibility, to making $30 or $40 an hour on a platform where they not only have flexibility, but they also develop an online reputation, which is so beneficial for someone who is low income and often has lacked any formal credentials. Expanding outward from this, where do we go from here? I think that the biggest opportunity we have in reducing poverty is getting corporations to change the way they spend money. This is a crazy statistic, but the biggest 2,000 companies in the world spend $12 trillion annually on goods and services. To put that into context, the GDP of all of sub-Saharan Africa is $1.8 trillion. So this is just a huge sum of money that vastly exceeds anything that we're going to raise in philanthropy or in foreign aid budgets, right? What if we could deploy some of this money that corporations are already spending on vendors like Samasource that actively solve a social or environmental problem in the way they do business? What if there were tax incentives for companies that did that? That's our mission with this Give Work movement, and we started by launching a Give Work guide. So this is a guide for companies and individuals to source ethically from brands that give work. And we really focus on models that deliberately hire low-income people and pay living wages. Many of them are also fair trade certified. Many of the companies in here are B corporations. And I really feel like the data is showing more and more that this is a more effective path forward than some of the more traditional solutions using philanthropy or aid. I'll say one other thing, which is that last year I launched a new company in this space called LXMI. We are the first fair trade and organic brand sold at Sephora nationwide. And I'm trying to do what we did at Samasource in the B2B space and transfer that to a consumer brand. So we're trying to build like a Chanel type brand in the social impact category that has the same give work model in the supply chain. We actually source rare ingredients in northern Uganda to build these skincare products. And my mission is to show the world that more companies can operate this way, that we shouldn't be outliers, and that you can create really high quality goods and services using a social impact or give work model. That's what I talk about in the book, that poverty is a problem that is totally solvable if we change the way we think about how we spend our dollars. And I'll wrap up just by telling you what happened to Ken. So Ken got a job with Samasource going through a local training program. We partner with NGOs in the slums who hire or who train people like Ken in basic computer skills. They become feeders for us. He got a job with Sama, very quickly rose through the ranks and became one of our top trainers. And the last time I met up with Ken was in Beirut, where he had taken his first plane trip to go and train Syrian refugees on a pilot program that we were doing with the World Food Program. So someone who literally came from that background in Mathari a few years later has now trained over 500 people to do work for major technology companies, including in places as far away as Lebanon. And that is the power of digital work. Instead of viewing Ken as a victim who deserves our charity, we can view him as an equal on a level playing field who is contributing to the global economy. Thanks so much, and I look forward to your questions.
I had the opportunity 2 weeks ago in New York to actually meet with and hear from Mohammed Yunus, the founder of the Grameen Bank that Leila just mentioned. And so I was just curious, you talk a little bit about this in the book, but just for the audience, if you could explain how you distinguish the two models and why you think, and I assume you do think, that giving work versus giving investment capital is a superior model.
Sure. Well, I will say that Mohammed Yunus is a hero, and I think that he's totally transformed the way that so many people think about how business can be used to fight poverty. So in no way do I want to discredit what he's doing, and I think microfinance has made huge strides in getting low-income people to be even seen by banks who previously just ignored them all, basically. And Yunus's idea is that access to finance and capital is one of the ways people can move out of poverty, and therefore we need to make this accessible to poor people. The challenge is that if you look at how the microfinance model works, it's basically injecting a small amount of capital into a local business. So let's say you're a woman in Mathare, you maybe have a farm outside the city, you go there, you collect tomatoes, and then you resell them in the slum. That's a typical kind of business that might be funded by microfinance. So you get a $150 loan to expand your tomato selling business. The problem is that you're selling to other people who make less than $2 a day. So the amount that your business can grow is constrained by the size of your market because you're living in a poor place. And this is the challenge with a lot of these local enterprise development solutions, is that no one gets catapulted out of poverty very quickly when their market is so constrained. The best way to move people out of poverty really quickly is to connect them to global markets, to a customer base that has dramatically more money. And as long as that's done on fair terms and we ensure that fair wages are being paid to those workers or those entrepreneurs, we see a pretty substantial benefit. Now, if we can make that happen through entrepreneurship, even better. If people like Ken are owning the business and not just working for the business, that's incredible. Let's do more of that. What we find is that many of our workers at Sama actually become entrepreneurs. Many of them have a side hustle. Once they start working with us, they start earning enough income to have a small side business. We have people starting, one of them started a pig farm in northern Uganda, which is now profitable, which employs 5 women. Another one has a shoe company that I think could like totally overtake Tom's. That's really beautiful, colorful shoes made in Kibera, another slum in Kenya, financed by his earnings at Sama. And I think the solution is connecting those types of people to global markets, not just local markets.
The interesting thing for me was the way you leveraged digital as a way to kind of connect those two markets you just talked about. Wealthy people here, very poor people there. With your new company, the product is obviously not digital. And so say a little more about how that changes things. So the fact that you're moving from something where you can transfer at essentially the speed of light information to where you're actually dealing with shea butter and real tangible products.
It's so hard. Like, don't start a CPG company is my advice to you. Physical stuff is so much harder. Yeah, consumer packaged goods. It's like the beautiful thing about Samasource is that it's really easy to move our stuff across borders. There's no regulation, there's no customs agents who are gonna hold it up. I don't have to like label my packages of data in a certain way for them to get through the border. All of that is true if you're moving physical stuff, and this is why I think digital work has so much promise. In the case of northern Uganda, we were lucky. We found a local semi-processing plant that presses these beautiful nuts that are actually grown wild on trees that take 20 years to mature. We sustainably harvest them. They press these nuts into a beautiful butter, and we're able to source that in these giant vats and send it to a lab in New Jersey where we jar the stuff. The reason I think LXMI is important is that I think that there's a whole new trend happening in the world of conservation around conservation incentives. We're realizing that perhaps the only way to convince people to preserve wild assets like these wild Nilotica trees or like parts of the Amazon, which are under serious threat, is to show them they can make more money off of the wild asset than they could selling the land. The biggest challenge we have right now, one of the biggest contributors to climate change, is the destruction of virgin rainforests, which sequesters carbon, right? And I think one of the most powerful ways to show a local community that they can make more money keeping that wild land is showing them that there might be a market for something like acai. This model has now been proven out in Brazil. There's a company called Runa, which is doing this with tea in Ecuador. There are a number of really cool initiatives that are basically creating conservation incentives. And I think that, along with the give work angle, is why it's important to do LXMI, even though it's really hard to get stuff across borders. I don't know how quickly we're going to be able to scale. It's a very different business model than Samasource.
The sustainability angle is interesting because it's not, you're right, it's a climate change issue. It's also a biodiversity issue as well. These are often very rich places, biodiverse rich places, which will be destroyed if they are simply used for farmland.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you about politics and then open it up to everyone and maybe ask you to tell one more story, which I thought was really interesting in your book. But on the politics of this, so you're not the first person to be critical of the traditional foreign aid model. A lot of people have criticized it for a whole set of reasons. You come at it slightly differently, but given the climate that we're in today and the struggles over even the minuscule financial foreign aid budget that we have in the US, how do you see that playing out? And are you concerned that you're adding fuel to a unfortunate fire?
Yeah, it's so tricky. I mean, I do think that people have a real distrust in government right now, and that we can use that to our benefit by showing people that you don't have to trust government, you can invest in social enterprises. And this new model of nonprofit companies that can solve social and environmental issues using business models is so exciting to me. Like, we should have, frankly, I think prisons should be run this way. And there's all sorts of really interesting new models. Here in LA, you have Homeboy Industries, which employs formerly incarcerated people. I don't understand why there aren't more incentives for companies to buy their, baked goods from Homeboy, because not only are you getting your, stuff in your lunchroom, but you're also actively fighting mass incarceration.
Incentives like tax incentives, or what sort of incentives would you want to see?
Tax incentives would be huge. Like, I think, any company that's hiring someone from an extremely low income background and paying living wages is actively performing a social service. A company that's hiring someone who's coming out of prison, who's at high risk of recidivism, which, by the way, costs us in California like $200,000 a year per person to keep someone in jail. There should be an incentive for a company that does that. And so many of the incentives we have now for corporations to move into a place have no requirements for actually hiring people in that place, especially not low-income people. So I actually think we can use this frustration people have with government and say, sure, we're frustrated too. Maybe government agencies aren't the answer. Maybe the answer is to fund lean social enterprises, but importantly, enterprises that are not driven solely by a profit motive. And I think that's the piece of it where a lot of people don't necessarily agree. And I don't think we have many powerful examples of social enterprises at scale, and we just need more of them.
And so do you see this model as, your model, as complementary to or in tension with the traditional foreign aid government to government model?
I think it's complementary. Look, I think the point of a foreign aid model should be, we as taxpayers, we often feel we have a moral duty to do something about people suffering on the other side of the world, right? If we're buying stuff in a global economy, if you buy cinnamon or pepper, you are contributing to someone's livelihood overseas, right? We are part of a global system, even though we're only citizens of one country, and therefore we have a moral duty to people in that global system. And so I absolutely think that we should be contributing to a foreign aid budget. The question is, how is that money getting spent? And is it getting spent in a way that actually measurably helps poor people? And if it's not, we should ask why and change it, right? And there are many, many reasons why aid is not directed to the most effective programs. That could be a whole other discussion. But in summary, that's my point. We should be investing in aid. There should be an agency that's collecting this tax money, but then it should be deploying it like an efficient venture capital firm on the most effective solutions based on real data for moving people out of poverty.
Great.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing your story. I think it's incredible. So my question is around the training program at Samasource. So can you just share a little bit more about what did it entail? And the reason why I'm asking is I used to work at an education company, and we ran several pilots. One of them was actually in a refugee camp, and they just failed miserably. So you have incredible results, so I'm curious to hear about that.
Sure. Our program training people for Samasource is called Digital Basics, and basically it's training people on using a computer and using different platforms to do digital work at a unit level. So some of what we do is image tagging for various computer vision companies. This is really cool, but we're actively involved in the training program for self-driving cars. So the program that teaches computers how to do driving, which is really cool, and our workers are really motivated by that, and a range of other kind of relatively new data services tasks. So it's really different. I've seen some computer training. When I first went to Dadab, I remember seeing a training program that seemed really kind of outmoded. Like, we were teaching people to do complex things in Excel, which, I mean, I don't know how to do, nor do I ever use in my job. So, why would somebody in a refugee camp necessarily need to know that? So I think part of it is just making sure that the training is really relevant to a job today. And that's what we focused on, is we feel like that's what our niche is, understanding what tech companies' needs are and then how to train people really specifically for those skills. And our curriculum is actually available, part of our curriculum is available for free at samaschool.org, the online version. We've had people take that curriculum and set up their own training programs with refugees in Ethiopia was one pilot. So we have people setting up these centers. We've actually been able to make it profitable as a co-working model. So basically you have a small facility, let's say you're an entrepreneur, you set up the internet and you have Wi-Fi and maybe you provide a few laptops, and then people, once they start earning money on digital freelancing sites through our training, can then start paying you a use fee per day or per month or per week. That model I think could be really cool because it doesn't take us to scale it. We could have partners all over the world who are just doing that locally.
Hi, my name is Julie Ortega. So I interviewed you for Insigniam Quarterly, actually. So that was amazing. So I'm very familiar with all the models. And thank you for taking time because I know you're extremely busy. So when we last spoke, you said that one of your big goals for Samasource and in general was to spread the idea of impact sourcing to a lot more companies. And it definitely the Give Work Guide suggests that that's been going really well, but I was curious if you've gotten any pushback from companies who just aren't interested in hearing about it, and how you address that or how you approach it.
Yeah. The biggest pushback comes from people who are like, well, capitalism says that people don't care about this, they just care about their profit margins. And I will say there's a lot of really good business evidence that this is important to do. So there's all these new studies about millennials and their purchasing behavior and the kind of companies they want to work for. There was a survey that went out that showed that 80% of millennials will only work for a company that has some sort of a social mission that they feel is authentic. Another data point is that 9 out of 10 millennials say that they're willing to switch brands to one associated with a good cause. And there's just more and more data coming out about how younger generations view their obligations to the world and how much they want to find meaning, not just on their nights and weekends, but at their day jobs and with the way that they spend their money. And that is really powerful evidence. And I can't tell you how many corporate leaders I share this with and they're like, wow, this is really compelling. The other piece of it is retention. So we've had so many examples of clients where people in the product team find Samasource and then they start working with us, and then we literally have them sending us emails in the middle of the night saying, oh my God, I am so inspired. I had no idea that in my job as a product manager at eBay, I would have the chance to fight poverty directly. And I've told my whole team about it. My team's making a visit to Uganda. We've had so many examples like that. One of our former clients turned his whole life around, ended up getting married in Haiti. We had a center in Haiti that we ended up rolling out to a partner, but he got married in Haiti, is now very active in the Haitian development scene. He's become a leader in this, and his whole company is very passionate about impact sourcing and giving work, simply because he signed a contract with us. And when you show employers that they're going to retain their people, longer, the people that they have on their teams are going to be more motivated and happier because they feel like there's meaning when they come to work every day, that is a very powerful, quantifiable bottom line benefit. And I think the next step for us is to quantify more of that.
Just follow up on that in terms of the kind of conscious consumerism that you talked about. Do you see a role for a standard setting body or some kind of label that's going to be the equivalent of what we see on fish or forest products and so forth?
Yeah.
And how significant is that?
Such a good question. We've been struggling with this because there are so many labels already. There's Fair Trade, which I think is a very credible label. There is B Corporation. We're going through the B Corporation process now with LXMI, which is slightly less stringent than Fair Trade on the issue of working with marginalized people. But still, to get through the B Corp thing, you have to really be behaving ethically as a company.
Sure.
Patagonia is a famous example, Method, Etsy. And so I don't know if we need another label, to be honest. I think what we need is more attention to be given to the companies that have those existing labels, right? And the other thing that's interesting is nonprofits right now often don't have any of those labels. So if you're a nonprofit that sells a good or a service, like Homeboy, I don't think, maybe fair trade has a label for you, but it's really like there's no label for you. So you don't show up in like a corporate vendor database. We're actually working now with SAP, which owns Ariba, which is the biggest corporate procurement database, to see if we can get like a sort of a subcategory around social enterprise in their system, so that if you're in charge of spending at, Logitech is a company we're talking to about this. If you're in charge of the procurement budget at Logitech, you could at least say, okay, we're going to source all the coffee in our lunchrooms, fair trade. We're going to make sure that all of the rugs that we buy, whatever, for the next conference we have come from a fair trade supplier. These might seem like small decisions, but they impact millions of artisanal workers and people at the base of the supply chains in these countries.
Sure. Other questions? Let's go right here.
I'm delighted that you chose Africa as a model for your program, because we have had this stereotype of Africa that simply it's ungovernable and it cannot be changed in any way. And I'm glad that your program is working so well there. Particularly, it seems, because you have placed the emphasis on each individual to be able to use their capacity to grow above who they are, or the people think who they are. At the same time, many of those governments in Kenya and Nigeria and even South Africa are found to be totally corrupt. Are they helping you or not helping you? Are they making any difference? And then bringing it back to the US, we have a lot of poor people here in the United States. Would your program work? For example, in Indiana, they tried this welfare to work program that became a complete disaster. And then Kentucky now, since they couldn't pass that new health program in Congress, has decided that people on Medicaid would have to work as well. But they don't get any aid in how to work, and therefore, they never get out of poverty, basically. Whereas you manage to elevate people to everything you can do. And finally, what do you think about universal basic income? That would also help, poor people and all of us, basically, get out of poverty.
Yeah. Really great questions. Okay, so governments, I've been surprised. So the government of Kenya is actually very progressive on these issues. They have a 2020 plan that involves digital jobs, and Jen, who was our first manager, she ran our whole East Africa, set up and ran our whole East Africa division from the early days. I think I last saw her in Nairobi. She could probably tell you a lot more about this, but they would show up at our launches, and they've definitely not tried to put any roadblocks in front of us. We're also quite small still, but I think the Kenyan government's excited that here's this organization that's moving away from the traditional handout or charity model, depicting their country as a bunch of poor people in slums who have no capacity, to a model where Kenya is the next frontier for digital talent. And I think the government is super excited about promoting that vision of the nation. And again, I think it creates a healthier relationship between people and government. We now have thousands of young people in Kenya who've come out of our program who are active citizens, who are going to challenge their government and demand accountability in a way that they might not have had they not had this opportunity. To your point about basic income in the US, so we have our US program, Sama School. We have tried working in rural America, and there's actually a whole chapter in the book. If you're curious about domestic poverty, check it out, because I talk about a big failure we had. So we set up in rural Arkansas several years ago in the Mississippi River Delta, which is one of the toughest places in the country to work. If you look at maps of poverty across the country, you'll see that it's most acute in places like the Delta and in Appalachia. And so I said, let's work in the toughest place we could in this entire nation and go to the Mississippi River Delta, where there is really poor access to internet. There's literally like no high-speed internet access in half the places we were trying to work in there, and low levels of literacy and generational trauma. I think we vastly underestimate the impact of Jim Crow and various other horrific things that happen to very low-income people of color across the South, especially. And we can't expect, I think, in such a short time, people to recover from that and bounce back and be able to have these great careers. I think it's just It's like shocking to me. So we tried to work in Arkansas, and we had so many challenges. People who came into our program were much less equipped to do this kind of work than people in slums in Kenya, to be totally honest. We had major problems with basic literacy. We had to revamp our whole curriculum just to teach people basic business English. So many issues. And so finally we ended up, because we didn't have enough money to support all of these side programs, which we had to develop to fully support these trainees, we had to shut the program down. The other big challenge in many parts of rural America is that there's no investment in them. So if you work in New York City or San Francisco, yes, there's a lot of poverty still in those places, but there's also an ecosystem of other enterprises, of a lot of wealthy people who are giving to philanthropic institutions. The cities themselves have money to spend on this. It was so hard for us to raise money for this rural community in Arkansas. We were literally getting like $5,000 grants, which really don't go very far nowadays. So I think the solution for some of these communities may well be some kind of basic income, some sort of transfer. My concern about universal basic income is that a lot of the advocates of it now, I think, are, like in Silicon Valley, we have a number of them who are saying UBI will solve the problem, and then we don't have to address the real core structural economic issues that are leading to this problem to begin with. I think we need to be talking about revising our tax structure. We need to be talking about what Bill Gates has proposed, a robot tax. If you're making money off of an algorithm that doesn't employ people, the whole tax model really needs to be reformed. Our tax model was built in a different era where to become a billionaire you had to employ lots and lots of people and treat them fairly. Now that's no longer the case. And so I think my fear with UBI is that we'll see it as the silver bullet and not have the very real conversations about redistribution and reforming the tax code that we need to have to prevent people from moving into poverty to begin with.
Great. Right here.
My question has to do with something you alluded to during your talk, which is that with the advent of some technology, the types of jobs or the number of jobs for folks in Samasource might be eroding. So you used the example of text recognition. Do you see this as a challenge going forward for Samasource? And if so, how do you imagine combating it?
Absolutely. Ray Kurzweil, the futurist, says that the singularity will happen in like 2045 or 2044, I think.
Why don't you define that?
Mark your calendars. Yes, the singularity is the moment at which computer intelligence will eclipse all human intelligence. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. I think about this a lot. I was on a panel, right, and who knows, like it's very hard to predict some of these things. On the flip side, we know a lot of people who are very senior in product and engineering at big tech companies who say it is going to be a long time before computers replace humans in so many areas, especially in things like speech and language, and I think a huge opportunity exists in the care industry. It's going to be a long time before I will want a robot watching my child or my aging grandparents, and so I think there's a huge number of new jobs that we can create, but we have to think really differently about what we value than we have in the past. So personally, I'm in favor of a works progress administration-like initiative. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the WPA, but there was a time when we decided to invest in job creation, rebuilding America's infrastructure, which we sorely need now, investing in things like there were even people paid at one point to go out and record oral history in the South. The Library of Congress has some of these archives, and it like blows my mind that at one point we decided as a society that these things were important and that we were going to fund people to go do them and pay living wages. So I think there are a number of ways we can get around the threat of AI and automation by creating jobs in new fields that are going to be untouched by that kind of automation for a very long time. Or maybe we'll just value interaction with a real human. I think there's been a resurgence in the interest, in consumer interest in artisan-made goods, things that are handmade, reconnecting with other humans, going to the farmer's market. And I really think that there's a psychological benefit and value that people associate with those things, and they might even be willing to pay more for goods that are produced that way.
Other questions? Let's go over here.
My question is, as we tend more towards social enterprise and using that to solve our problem rather than government, yes, government has plenty of issues, but then where does oversight come in when we know we can vote people out of office? We know we can go to town halls and advocate for different policies, but then if it's a private company, how do I have any say?
It's a great question. I really feel like the ideal role of government is in basically collecting taxes and functioning as some sort of, venture capital firm, but where the ultimate aim is not making lots of money, but solving social and environmental problems at the community level. Now, this doesn't work for everything, and I'm not advocating that we should just completely dissolve every government agency at all. But I do think that there are many areas in which government has shown itself to not be the best, administrator. Arguably, education might be one of those fields, right? And it might make sense to have social enterprises that are not profit-oriented, but that are results-oriented and that have to produce third-party backed data. So there's now this new movement around impact auditing. There are actually companies that will audit your firm just like normal financial auditing, but for impact metrics. So it used to be that we said, well, there's no way we can measure social impact. It's too hard to define. Therefore, we just have to look at how a company is spending its money. So to date, most nonprofit kind of oversight has really relied on what percentage of your budget is spent on overhead, which is total BS. Like, that doesn't tell you anything about whether the organization's actually achieving any real outcome, right? I don't care how much money they're spending on pencils every year. And so now there's a new field of impact auditing groups. One of them is led by a development economist named Dean Carlin. They're called Impact Matters. We just published our first impact audit by Impact Matters. And they do just what
Say how
financial
many
auditors
stars
would
you
do.
got.
Oh, we got 8 out of 9 stars. Thank you. Thanks for highlighting that. But I think this is so exciting because now we can say, okay, here's an objective third-party review of whether we're hitting our impact targets. That could provide the basis for awarding contracts, right? I think there should be procurement incentives or procurement requirements for city governments to purchase from social enterprises. It's crazy to me that they're buying from any old company that has no obligation to actually do anything for the society in which it's operating. What if the city of Los Angeles had a requirement to purchase whatever percent of its goods and services from local social enterprises that had above a certain rating by impact auditors? So I feel like there's a whole new world of possibilities now that we have better third-party metrics and data collection in the field.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe 2 more. So let me do this. I'm going to take a couple of questions at the end. Okay. So why don't we start here, and then other hands there. So why don't you bring that mic there? You bring that mic there. We'll take 2. You start, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Logan Van Meter. Thank you so much for being here. You talked about some of the difficulty with having a physical product like you do with LXMI, and kind of how you expand or scale that. Do you see any possibility of expanding into other natural resources, other countries, other people that can be harvesters, or do you see the Nilotica being as kind of a limiting factor there?
Yeah, and I also brought samples for anyone who wants to try it. We actually have been, so one of the things I love doing is like going to far-flung corners of the world and finding weird ingredients in the jungle. Aligns really well with my job. So I've been to this part of the Amazon called the Guyana Shield, and I'm working with Conservation International, potentially on sourcing a very rare ingredient from this region in the company of this indigenous group that is developing the supply chain with us. And so we'd be the first skincare company to ever launch this rare oil, and it has all these really cool benefits, and I think that would be such a good model. And in my mind, if you're gonna pay a few $100s for a jar of skin cream, by the way, my favorite jar of skin cream, I won't say the brand, but I discovered that it was full of the main ingredient was basically Vaseline, petrolatum. So many of these super high-end cosmetics are made of total junk. The cost of goods is nothing. They're doing nothing to benefit the world. Why not have a product that not only makes you prettier, but makes the world more beautiful? So we have that now. That's one of the projects we're working on. We have another one in Myanmar, although with the recent events there, I'm not sure what's going to happen. But there's a whole list of rare ingredients that we're working on, and part of the mission is to support biodiversity and even awareness that these rare plants might have some of the most important solutions in health and in personal care, and we really haven't looked to plants in this way.
You mentioned that some of your success cases have set up side gigs of their own and that they're also hiring people. And I'm going to guess, because you're in northern Uganda, I'll guess that you're operating out of Gulu. When people have a success through your system and they in turn set up something and hire other people, are they willing to spread the knowledge? For example, do Acholi people hire Karamojong people, or do they keep hiring their own cousins?
Yeah.
and
That's a great
spreading
question.
the knowledge. Does the knowledge make its way through
Yeah.
the region and the country, or does it stay within their own
Yeah.
tribe?
Great question. So one of the coolest things that we see at Sama is the amount of collaboration across our work centers. We just did a big soccer tournament actually with all of our alumni and workers from Uganda and Kenya. And so we bussed in the Ugandans. They came to this big soccer field in the middle of Nairobi, and everyone was just having the best time and hanging out. And they really view themselves as part of one family and community. And I think the social mission unifies people. A lot of people encounter someone from, northern Uganda who comes from a background of rural poverty. They might have come from a slum, and they see a lot of common ground. I think when you bond people together in a work setting where they have to work closely in teams, those differences totally resolve. So we've never had a challenge with that. Many of our workers, when they go on to hire people, will hire the best possible worker for the job.
We have books outside. Will you be available to sign?
Yes, I will hang out to sign and to hand out LXMI samples and answer questions.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all.